The sound of shattering glass followed Ava down 3 flights of stairs, each footstep echoing her thundering heartbeat as she fled into the Seattle night. Her bare feet slapped against wet concrete, the October rain soaking through her thin cotton dress within seconds. Behind her, Marcus's voice boomed through their apartment window, hurling threats and promises that made her stomach clench with familiar terror. She had learned to recognize the signs. The way his jaw tightened when he came home from another failed job interview. The deliberate crack of his knuckles before his hands found her throat. Tonight, when he discovered the hidden phone she used to research shelters, something darker than usual had flickered behind his eyes. Something that whispered this time would be different. This time he might not stop. The alley between 3rd and Pine offered temporary refuge, a narrow corridor of darkness between 2 towering buildings where the city's forgotten souls sought shelter from more than just the weather. Ava pressed her back against cold brick, chest heaving as she tried to calm her racing pulse. The rain had turned vicious, driving horizontally now, and she wrapped her arms around herself against the chill that went deeper than mere cold. For those watching from distant places where autumn nights might be falling just as unforgivingly, there is something universal about the moment when running becomes the only choice left. That instant when staying means surrendering the last fragments of yourself to someone else's rage. A low rumble of voices drifted from deeper in the alley, speaking in rapid Korean. Ava pressed herself flatter against the wall, recognizing the cadence of urgency even if the words remained foreign. 3 men in expensive suits stood in a semicircle around a 4th figure kneeling on the rain-slicked pavement. Even from 30 feet away, she could see the kneeling man's hands trembling. The tallest of the 3 stepped forward with predatory grace. His movements held the controlled stillness of a man accustomed to absolute authority, every gesture deliberate and economical. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of final judgment despite its soft tone. "Kim Jae-sung, I trusted you with my sister's protection," he said in accented English, each word precisely enunciated. "You sold that trust to the Tanaka family for $30,000. The kneeling man's response came in broken sobs, a mixture of Korean pleading and English denials that fooled no one present. Ava found herself unable to look away as the tall man reached inside his jacket with movements that seemed almost ceremonial in their careful precision. The gunshot cracked through the alley like thunder, sharp and final. The pleading stopped. The kneeling figure crumpled forward, and the 3 men in suits began speaking in low, efficient tones about cleanup and timing. Ava's gasp escaped before she could stop it. The tall man's head turned toward her hiding spot with the focused attention of a predator detecting movement. His eyes found hers across the distance, and she felt pinned beneath a gaze that seemed to catalog every detail of her presence with cold calculation. "Don't move," one of the other men said, his hand moving toward his jacket. "Wait," the tall man commanded, still studying Ava with unsettling intensity. "She's alone, frightened." He approached with the same controlled grace she had observed moments before, each step measured and purposeful. Up close, she could see the sharp lines of his face, the way expensive fabric draped his lean frame, and the complete absence of fear in his dark eyes despite having just committed murder. "What's your name?" he asked when he stood close enough that she could smell the subtle scent of sandalwood and bergamot that clung to his clothing. "Ava," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "And what brings you to this particular alley at this particular hour, Ava?" The simple question unlocked something inside her chest, 3 years of accumulated terror spilling out in a rush of words she couldn't control. "I was running from my boyfriend, ex-boyfriend. He hits me and tonight I thought he might kill me, so I ran and I don't have anywhere to go, and I saw you and I know I shouldn't have been here, but I was just trying to hide, and I won't tell anyone what I saw, I promise. I just need somewhere safe." The confession hung between them in the rain-heavy air. The other 2 men shifted restlessly, their implications clear even without words. The tall man continued studying her face with clinical precision, as if reading a document that contained information crucial to some larger calculation. "My name is Jin Woo-hyun," he said finally. "I am not in the business of providing sanctuary to strangers." "Please," Ava whispered, the word torn from some desperate place she hadn't known existed. "I'll do anything. I just can't go back to him." Something flickered across Jin Woo-hyun's features, too quick to identify but profound enough to shift the entire tenor of the moment. He glanced at his associates, then back to her rain-soaked form pressed against the alley wall. "Anything is a dangerous word to use with men like me," he said quietly. "Do you understand what you're asking?" "I understand that you're the most dangerous person I've ever met," she replied with startling honesty. "And right now, that feels safer than going home." The admission surprised them both. Jin Woo-hyun's carefully controlled expression cracked just enough to reveal something that might have been recognition, as if he understood exactly what kind of fear could make a stranger's violence seem preferable to familiar cruelty. He turned to his men and spoke rapid Korean that sounded like orders. One of them began to protest, but Jin Woo silenced him with a single look that promised consequences for continued disagreement. "You witnessed something tonight that could destroy lives," Jin Woo said, returning his attention to Ava. "Mine included. That creates certain obligations for both of us." "I understand." "I don't think you do," he replied, but his tone had gentled almost imperceptibly. "However, circumstances have placed you under my protection whether either of us planned for it or not. Come with me and I will ensure your safety. Refuse and you remain free to face whatever consequences await you on your own." The choice was no choice at all, but something in his phrasing acknowledged her agency even as he defined her options. Ava pushed herself away from the wall, her legs unsteady but determined. "I'll come with you." Jin Woo-hyun nodded once, as if confirming a business arrangement rather than accepting responsibility for another human life. He removed his jacket and draped it around her shoulders, the fabric still warm from his body and heavy with that distinctive scent that would soon become as familiar as her own heartbeat. "Then we go now, before your absence is noticed by anyone who might follow." As they walked toward a sleek black sedan that materialized from the shadows like something summoned, Ava realized she had traded one form of captivity for another. The difference lay not in the cage itself, but in the nature of the man holding the key. Behind them, the alley returned to its rain-soaked silence, keeping its secrets as it always had. The last sound Marcus would ever make in her life was his voice echoing down from their apartment window, calling her name into the empty night. By the time his words reached the place where she had been, Jin Woo-hyun's sedan was already disappearing into Seattle's maze of streets, carrying her toward a world where power wore expensive suits and protection came with prices she couldn't yet comprehend. Sunlight filtering through floor-to-ceiling windows woke Ava from the deepest sleep she had experienced in 3 years. For a moment, suspended between dream and consciousness, she forgot where she was. Then the scent of sandalwood and bergamot drifted from the silk shirt she still wore, and memory crashed back with startling clarity. The room around her belonged to a different world entirely. Cream-colored walls rose to meet a coffered ceiling detailed in gold leaf, while Persian rugs in deep burgundy and midnight blue created islands of warmth across polished hardwood floors. The bed itself was a monument to luxury, its carved headboard reaching toward the ceiling like something from a Korean palace, draped in linens that felt like liquid against her skin. A soft knock interrupted her survey of opulent surroundings. "Come in," she called, her voice still rough with sleep. The woman who entered moved with the quiet efficiency of someone accustomed to serving powerful people. She carried a silver tray bearing delicate porcelain and what smelled like jasmine tea, her expression carefully neutral as she set it on the mahogany table near the windows. "Mr. Hyun requests your presence in his study when you are ready," the woman said in lightly accented English. "Fresh clothing has been provided in the wardrobe." Ava nodded, suddenly aware of how she must look in Jin Woo's oversized shirt and yesterday's fear. "Thank you. What should I call you?" "Mrs. Chan," the woman replied with the faintest smile. "I manage the household. If you need anything during your stay, please ask." The emphasis on stay suggested temporary arrangements, though Ava suspected the duration remained entirely at Jin Woo's discretion. After Mrs. Chun withdrew with silent footsteps, she discovered the wardrobe contained clothing in her exact size, from undergarments to a simple but elegant navy dress that fit as if tailored specifically for her body. The realization that Jin Woo had somehow obtained her measurements while she slept sent an uncomfortable chill down her spine. The man missed nothing, calculated everything, and clearly commanded resources that made such impossible tasks routine. Jin Woo's study occupied the entire east wing of what she was beginning to understand was less house than fortress. Books in Korean, English, and what looked like Japanese lined the walls from floor to ceiling, their leather spines creating a tapestry of knowledge and culture. Behind an imposing desk of dark wood, Jin Woo sat reading what appeared to be financial reports, his movements precise as he made notations in the margins. He had changed from last night's blood-stained clothing into a charcoal suit that emphasized the lean power of his frame. Morning light revealed details the alley's shadows had hidden. The sharp intelligence in his dark eyes, the way his hands moved with surgeon's precision, the subtle scar that traced from his left temple to his jawline like evidence of past violence survived. "Sleep well?" he asked without looking up from his papers. "Better than I have in years," Ava admitted, surprising herself with the honesty. This pleased him, though his satisfaction showed only in the slight relaxation around his eyes. "Good. Fear is exhausting. You needed rest before we discuss terms." Terms? Now he did look up, subjecting her to the same clinical assessment she remembered from the alley. "Sit," he commanded, indicating a leather chair positioned across from his desk. The single word carried absolute authority, spoken by a man unaccustomed to requests being ignored. Ava found herself complying before consciously deciding to do so, then felt a spike of irritation at her own automatic obedience. "Let me explain your situation clearly," Jin Woo began, setting aside his reports to give her complete attention. "You witnessed me kill a man who betrayed my organization. That knowledge makes you either an asset or a liability. Nothing else." The bluntness of his statement stole her breath. "I told you I wouldn't say anything. What you told me was that you would do anything for protection." His voice remained level, but something dangerous flickered beneath the surface. "Those are the terms I'm prepared to offer." He opened a leather folder and withdrew several documents, spreading them across the polished surface between them with the care of a man revealing winning cards. "Your ex-boyfriend Marcus Williams has already contacted the police about your disappearance. He's filed a missing person report and convinced them you were likely kidnapped. Very touching concern for a man who spent 3 years using you as a punching bag." Heat flooded Ava's cheeks, shame and anger warring for dominance. "How do you know about that?" "I know everything that matters about your life as of 6 hours ago." Jin Woo's tone suggested such comprehensive intelligence gathering was routine business practice. "Marcus has also reached out to several private investigators and what he believes are criminal contacts in hopes of tracking you down. His sudden dedication to finding you suggests he views you as property rather than a person he's lost." The observation cut too close to truth for comfortable denial. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that walking away from here exposes you to dangers you haven't considered. Marcus has made your disappearance public. If you surface independently, you become a witness law enforcement will want to interview extensively. If they discover your connection to last night's events, you become a problem for my organization that I will solve permanently." The threat hung between them like smoke, poisoning the morning air with its implications. "But," Jin Woo continued, his voice softening almost imperceptibly, "there is an alternative arrangement that serves both our interests." He slid a single sheet of paper toward her, its contents written in both English and Korean characters. "Complete protection from Marcus, from law enforcement, and from any consequences of what you witnessed. New identity if necessary. Financial security. Physical safety guaranteed by the full resources of my organization. In exchange, you live under my authority, follow my instructions without question, and maintain absolute silence about our business." Ava stared at the document, recognizing both salvation and imprisonment in its precise language. "And if I refuse? Then you leave now, immediately, with my thanks for an interesting evening and my assurance that I will not personally harm you. What happens afterward depends entirely on your ability to navigate the consequences of last night on your own." The choice was elegant in its simplicity and terrifying in its implications. accept his protection and surrender her independence, or reject his offer and face Marcus, the police, and potentially Jean Wu's enemies with nothing but her own resources. She looked up to find him studying her face with that unsettling intensity, as if her decision would reveal something fundamental about her character. What exactly would living under your authority mean? It means you go where I permit, speak to whom I approve, and conduct yourself according to standards I establish. Your safety becomes my responsibility, which makes your behavior my concern. Before she could respond, the study door opened to admit two men who moved with the controlled stillness she was learning to associate with Jean Wu's associates. Both wore expensive suits that failed to completely conceal the weapons they undoubtedly carried, their eyes automatically scanning the room for threats before focusing on their boss. The older of the two spoke rapid Korean, his tone suggesting disagreement with whatever decision Jean Wu had made. She caught Marcus's name in the fluid syllables, along with what sounded like objections being raised and dismissed. Jean Wu responded in the same language, his voice carrying absolute finality despite its quiet tone. When the man continued to argue, Jean Wu's expression shifted to something that made both men step back involuntarily. I have decided, he said, switching to English for Ava's benefit. The matter is closed. After the men withdrew with obvious reluctance, Jean Wu returned his attention to her as if the interruption had been merely a minor business detail. They questioned the wisdom of bringing you here, he explained with characteristic directness. They consider you a liability that should be eliminated rather than protected. And what do you consider me? The question seemed to surprise him, as if no one had ever asked his personal opinion rather than simply accepting his decisions. I consider you someone who recognized safety when she saw it, even when that safety wore an unusual face. That suggests intelligence and survival instinct rather than merely desperation. The unexpected compliment caught her off guard. You're saying I made a smart choice trusting you instead of running? I'm saying you made the only choice that kept you alive. Whether it proves smart depends entirely on how well you adapt to your new circumstances. Ava picked up the contract again, reading through its terms more carefully. The language was precise but not unnecessarily harsh, outlining expectations rather than punishments. Still, beneath the formal phrasing lay an unmistakable reality. She would belong to him as completely as if he had purchased her outright. What happens if Marcus finds me anyway? She asked. He won't, Jean Wu replied with absolute certainty. As of this morning, Marcus Williams believes you left Seattle entirely. His investigation will take him in directions that lead away from this place and everyone in it. How can you be so sure? Because I made certain he received information that confirms his worst fears while pointing him toward conclusions I want him to reach. Marcus is looking for a victim who fled to family in another state. He will not think to look for a woman who chose to place herself under the protection of someone far more dangerous than he could ever hope to be. The casual manipulation in his voice should have frightened her. Instead, Ava felt something closer to relief that such calculating intelligence was being deployed on her behalf rather than against her. She signed the contract with steady hands, sealing her fate with careful cursive letters that transformed her from refugee to protected asset in the space of a signature. Welcome to my world, Jean Wu said quietly, the closest thing to warmth she had yet heard in his voice. I promise you will find it safer than the one you left behind. The third morning brought small revelations that spoke to a level of attention Ava hadn't expected. On the marble nightstand beside her bed, she discovered a prescription bottle bearing her name and yesterday's date. Her antidepressants, the ones she had been rationing for weeks because Marcus controlled their finances too tightly for regular refills. Beside the medication sat a plate of fresh strawberries cut precisely into quarters, the way she had always preferred them since childhood. No one should have known about either detail. Marcus had forbidden her from taking what he called happy pills, and the strawberry preference was something she hadn't shared with another living soul since her grandmother's death. Yet here both sat, evidence of surveillance so thorough it bordered on mind reading. Mrs. Chun appeared with morning tea as if summoned by telepathy, her movements carrying the same quiet efficiency Ava was learning to associate with everyone in Jean Wu's employ. Mr. Hyun requests that you join him for breakfast when convenient, the older woman said, setting down a service that included jasmine tea and what looked like Korean pastries filled with red bean paste. Where does he take his meals? The main dining room overlooks the garden. Mrs. Chun paused delicately. He also wishes you to know that Dr. Morrison will arrive this afternoon to conduct a general health examination. Standard procedure for all extended guests. The clinical phrasing couldn't disguise what amounted to another layer of control disguised as care. Still, Ava found herself grateful rather than resentful. When had anyone last been concerned enough about her well-being to schedule medical attention without being asked? The dining room revealed itself as another exercise in understated luxury. Its long table capable of seating 20 but set for an intimate breakfast for two. Jean Woo sat at the head position, reading what appeared to be morning financial reports while steam rose from his coffee cup in lazy spirals. Morning light softened the harsh angles of his face without diminishing the aura of controlled power that seemed as natural to him as breathing. He wore a navy suit that looked custom-tailored, its fabric catching the light in ways that suggested threads more expensive than most people's monthly salaries. "Good morning," he said without looking up from his papers, though something in his posture suggested complete awareness of her presence. "Good morning," Ava replied, uncertain whether she should sit or wait for invitation. "Sit wherever you're comfortable," he added, finally raising his eyes to study her face with that clinical attention she was beginning to recognize as his default expression. She chose a chair 2 seats down from him, close enough for conversation but far enough to maintain some illusion of independence. The meal that arrived moments later revealed the same unsettling attention to detail. Steel-cut oats prepared exactly as she liked them, fresh orange juice, and coffee with the precise amount of cream she preferred. "You seem surprised by the menu," Jean Woo observed. "I'm wondering how you know things about me that I never told you." His smile held no warmth, but something in his eyes suggested amusement at her directness. "Information is currency in my world. Knowing what matters to the people under my protection is simply good business practice. And what matters to me is how I like my breakfast. What matters to you is feeling cared for rather than controlled," he replied with startling insight. "The strawberries and medication serve the same purpose as the designer clothes and luxury accommodations. They demonstrate that your well-being is my priority, which makes accepting my authority easier to bear." The calculated honesty should have disturbed her. Instead, Ava felt something close to relief that he acknowledged the manipulation rather than pretending his gestures were purely altruistic. "And if I said I didn't want to be managed like a psychological case study, then I would adjust my approach accordingly," Jean Woo said without hesitation. "But I would not stop ensuring your safety and comfort. The methods might change, but the outcome would remain the same." 3 days passed in similar fashion, establishing routines that felt simultaneously natural and artificial. Ava discovered that Jean Woo kept meticulous schedules, rising before dawn to handle international business calls from his study. She learned to recognize the subtle differences in his associates' behavior that indicated whether their boss's mood was merely serious or dangerously focused. Most surprisingly, she began to feel safe in ways that had nothing to do with armed guards or security systems. For the first time in 3 years, she went to sleep without checking that her bedroom door was locked. She walked through the compound's corridors without constantly scanning for exits or weapons. Her shoulders gradually released tension she hadn't realized she was carrying. On the 4th night, insomnia drove her from her bed near midnight to explore the compound's common areas. She discovered Jean Woo in his study, seated in the leather chair behind his desk with a book opened in his lap. The warm light of a banker's lamp cast shadows across his features, softening the harsh lines into something almost vulnerable. He was reading in Korean, his lips moving silently as he worked through complex passages with the concentration of someone engaging with difficult philosophy rather than light entertainment. "Couldn't sleep either?" she asked from the doorway. Jean Woo looked up without startlement, as if he had been aware of her presence long before she spoke. "Sleep is often elusive when the mind carries too many responsibilities," he replied, closing the book carefully and setting it aside. "What were you reading?" "Classical poetry about duty and honor. Not exactly bedtime material, but it helps me think through complex problems." The admission revealed a depth she hadn't expected, suggesting that beneath his carefully controlled exterior lived someone who turned to ancient wisdom for guidance, rather than simply relying on modern pragmatism. What kind of problems require poetry to solve? Jin Woo studied her for a long moment, as if weighing how much honesty their relationship could bear. The kind where all available choices carry consequences I must live with forever, he said finally. Before she could respond, the sound of raised voices drifted from somewhere deeper in the compound. Jin Woo's expression shifted instantly from contemplative to coldly alert, his hand moving automatically toward the weapon she now knew he always carried. The voices grew closer, revealing themselves as an argument between two of his associates, their Korean rapid and heated. Through the open study door, she caught sight of the same men who had questioned her presence during her first morning, their gestures sharp with frustration. One of them spoke directly to Jin Woo, his tone suggesting disagreement with established policy. She didn't understand the words, but the contemptuous glance toward her position made the subject matter clear enough. Jin Woo's response was quiet but devastating, spoken in the same language but carrying unmistakable authority. When the man attempted to continue his argument, Jin Woo rose from his chair with fluid grace and said something that made both associates step backward involuntarily. The conversation ended abruptly, the men bowing slightly before withdrawing with obvious reluctance. Jin Woo remained standing until their footsteps faded entirely, his posture radiating controlled fury that had nothing to do with her presence and everything to do with subordinates who questioned his decisions. "They don't approve of me being here," Ava said when silence returned to the study. "Their approval is neither required nor requested," Jin Woo replied, settling back into his chair as if the interruption had been merely a minor business detail. "They understand only strength and weakness, protection and liability. They cannot comprehend situations that exist outside those simple categories." "And which category do I fall into?" "You fall into a category I created specifically for you," he said, his voice carrying an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "One that requires no justification to anyone but myself." 2 days later, that protection revealed itself in more dramatic fashion. Jin Woo returned from a business meeting with blood on his shirt cuff and a gash across his left hand that suggested violence had been part of the negotiations. He dismissed Mrs. Chen's offer to summon medical attention, instead accepting Ava's suggestion that she clean and bandage the wound herself. Sitting across from him in the study's leather chairs, she worked carefully to clean away dried blood while he remained perfectly still despite what must have been considerable pain. His hand in hers felt warm and surprisingly gentle for something capable of such destruction, the calluses on his fingers telling stories of violence survived and battles won. "You don't have to be quite so stoic," she said softly, noting how his jaw remained rigidly controlled even when the antiseptic surely stung. "I've seen people react to pain before. Showing weakness invites exploitation," Jin Woo replied, though something in his tone suggested the response was automatic rather than personally directed. "I'm not exactly in a position to exploit anything," Ava pointed out, wrapping gauze around his palm with careful precision. "Besides, trusting someone to help you when you're hurt isn't weakness. It's just being human." The observation seemed to surprise him, as if the concept of accepting care without strategic calculation was foreign to his experience. When she finished with the bandage and began gathering the medical supplies, he caught her wrist gently with his uninjured hand. "My younger sister used to say similar things," he said quietly, his voice carrying pain that had nothing to do with physical wounds. "She believed that strength came from connection rather than isolation, that protecting others required accepting protection in return." "What happened to her?" "I failed to keep her safe," he replied with devastating simplicity. "She died because I wasn't strong enough to protect her from people who wanted to hurt me through her." The confession hung between them like smoke, revealing wounds far deeper than anything requiring bandages. Ava found herself studying his face, seeing past the controlled mask to the man beneath who carried guilt like a physical weight. "I'm sorry," she said, meaning it completely. "Don't be sorry. Learn from it." Jin Woo's fingers tightened slightly around her wrist, the gesture unconscious and surprisingly intimate. "Anyone I care about becomes a target for my enemies." That's why accepting my protection means accepting isolation from your previous life. It's not cruelty, it's survival. For the first time since signing his contract, Ava understood that Jin Woo's control wasn't about domination but about prevention. He wasn't keeping her captive to possess her, but to protect her from the same fate that had claimed his sister. She's the reason you helped me that night, isn't she? Jin Woo released her wrist and leaned back in his chair, though his eyes never left her face. She's the reason I recognized someone worth protecting when I saw her, he confirmed. You have the same strength she had. The same refusal to break even when everything around you was falling apart. The comparison should have felt like pressure, being measured against someone who clearly held his devotion even in death. Instead, Ava felt honored to be seen as carrying qualities he valued enough to die protecting. That night, she fell asleep with his sandalwood and bergamot scent still clinging to her hands from treating his wound. For the first time in longer than she could remember, her dreams were peaceful, filled with images of safety that wore expensive suits and spoke in quiet voices that promised absolute protection. When she woke the next morning, she realized that somewhere in the process of accepting his care and offering her own in return, the nature of their arrangement had shifted. She was no longer simply a protected asset, and he was no longer merely her keeper. They had become something more complex, more dangerous, and infinitely more real. The photograph sat on Jin Woo's desk like an accusation, its silver frame catching morning light in ways that made the captured moment seem to glow with life. A young woman with Jin Woo's intelligent eyes smiled at the camera, her graduation cap slightly askew and her arms wrapped around a man who looked decades younger than the controlled predator Ava had come to know. Jin Hai, he said quietly when he noticed her studying the image during their morning meeting about security protocols. My sister. She would have been 26 last month. The past tense carried weight that went beyond simple grammar, settling into the study's atmosphere like smoke that couldn't quite dissipate. Ava found herself studying the photograph more carefully, seeing joy and innocence in features that shared Jin Woo's bone structure but none of his careful guardedness. She was beautiful, Ava said, meaning it completely. She was everything I wasn't. Kind without calculation. Trusting without being naive. Strong enough to believe that loving people made you more powerful rather than more vulnerable. Jin Woo's fingers drummed against his desk's polished surface, the only sign of agitation in an otherwise perfectly controlled presentation. When he spoke again, his voice carried the careful neutrality of someone reciting facts rather than reliving memories. The Yamamoto family wanted to expand their influence into Seattle's port operations. I refused their initial overtures for partnership, then blocked their attempts to establish territory through violence. They decided that hurting someone I loved would prove more effective than direct confrontation. The clinical recitation couldn't disguise the pain beneath, though Ava suspected Jin Woo would die before acknowledging vulnerability so directly. They took her from her apartment on a Thursday evening while she was preparing for graduate school interviews. She had been accepted to Seoul National University's International Law program, planned to specialize in human rights advocacy. The irony wasn't lost on anyone involved. Ava felt her chest tighten with sympathetic anguish, recognizing the particular agony of loving someone whose dreams would never be fulfilled. The Yamamoto demands were simple. Jin Woo continued with that same devastating calm. Complete withdrawal from port operations, formal acknowledgement of their territorial claims, and payment of tribute that would have bankrupted half our legitimate businesses. In exchange, Jin Hai would be returned unharmed after a suitable period of education about consequences. What did you do? I gathered every resource at my disposal and prepared to give them exactly what they wanted. He admitted without shame. Pride matters less than family. Business territories can be rebuilt. Sisters cannot be replaced. But they didn't keep their word. Ava guessed, her voice barely above a whisper. Jin Woo's expression shifted to something that made the study's temperature seem to drop several degrees. They killed her anyway, 3 days before the agreed exchange. Left her body where I would find it along with a message that I should have known better than to trust Yakuza promises. The confession hung between them like a bridge spanning an abyss of grief too deep for words. Ava found herself moving closer to his desk without conscious decision, drawn by an impulse to offer comfort that probably violated every boundary their arrangement was supposed to maintain. "I'm so sorry," she said, the words feeling completely inadequate. "Don't be sorry for something that happened years ago," Jin Woo replied, though his voice had gentled almost imperceptibly. "Learn from it instead. Understand why I take threats to people under my protection so seriously." She reached across the desk to touch his hand, a gesture that would have been unthinkable even days earlier. His fingers were warm beneath hers, steady despite the emotional weight of his revelations. "You couldn't have known they would break their agreement," she said softly. "I should have acted faster, should have anticipated their deception, should have been strong enough to destroy them before they could hurt her." The self-recrimination in his voice made something ache deep in Ava's chest, recognizing the impossible standards he set for himself and the guilt he carried for failing to meet them. "Sometimes people we love get hurt despite everything we do to protect them," she said, thinking of her own grandmother's death from cancer. The way helplessness had felt like personal failure. "That doesn't make it our fault." Jin Woo's eyes met hers with startling directness, as if her words had penetrated defenses he hadn't realized were still standing. "You sound like she did," he said quietly. "Jin Hai used to tell me that accepting responsibility for everything in the world was just another form of arrogance. That some pain comes from circumstances beyond our control, not from personal inadequacy." "She sounds like someone who understood you very well." "She understood me better than I understood myself," Jin Woo confirmed. She saw through the reputation and the fear others felt to recognize that protection was the only thing I had ever truly wanted to be good at. Ava felt something shift in her chest, a recognition that went deeper than simple sympathy. "She's why you helped me that night, isn't she? You saw something familiar in my situation. I saw someone who refused to break even when everything around her was falling apart. The same strength Jin Hai had, the same determination to survive with dignity intact. The comparison should have felt like pressure, being measured against someone who clearly held his devotion even in death. Instead, Ava felt honored to be seen as carrying qualities he valued enough to die protecting." Their moment of connection shattered when rapid footsteps approached the study, followed by urgent knocking that suggested crisis rather than routine business. Jin Woo's expression shifted instantly from vulnerable to coldly alert, his hand moving automatically toward the weapon he always carried. "Enter," he commanded, his voice carrying absolute authority. Two of his senior associates burst through the door with the kind of energy that preceded either excellent news or devastating problems. Their faces suggested the latter. They spoke in rapid Korean, their gestures sharp with agitation and what looked like barely controlled fury. Ava caught her own name several times in the flood of foreign syllables, along with what sounded like urgent recommendations for immediate action. Whatever crisis had developed clearly centered around her presence in Jin Woo's compound. Jin Woo's responses grew progressively shorter and more dangerous, his voice dropping to the quiet tone she was learning to associate with lethal decision-making. When one associate produced a smartphone and showed him something on its screen, his expression turned to winter incarnate. "What's happening?" Ava asked when the conversation paused. "The Tanaka family has made inquiries about your presence here," Jin Woo said without looking away from his associates' faces. "They believe holding you would provide leverage over my operations." The casual way he discussed her potential kidnapping made her stomach clench with familiar terror, but something in his posture suggested the threat was already being neutralized rather than developing. "They sent representatives to your former workplace asking questions about your relationship with Marcus and your sudden disappearance. When that inquiry was redirected through channels they didn't anticipate, they concluded you might be more valuable than your circumstances suggested." Ava felt ice form in her veins. "They know where I am? They know you're under my protection," Jin Woo corrected, his tone carrying grim satisfaction. "What they don't know is that threatening someone I have claimed as mine carries consequences their imagination cannot encompass." He turned to his associates and spoke in Korean, his instructions delivered with the clinical precision of someone issuing orders for surgical strikes rather than business negotiations. Both men nodded grimly and withdrew to implement whatever devastating response he had outlined. When silence returned to the study, Jean Wu's attention focused on her with predatory intensity that made her pulse quicken for reasons that had nothing to do with fear. "I need you to understand something clearly," he said, his voice carrying absolute certainty. "The moment I accepted responsibility for your protection, you became mine in every sense that matters. Anyone who attempts to harm you declares war on everything I have built, everyone I employ, and every alliance I have cultivated." The possessive declaration should have frightened her. Instead, Ava felt something closer to fierce satisfaction that someone finally considered her worth defending with such devastating completeness. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to remind the Tanaka family why threatening my people is considered a fatal error in judgment." Jean Wu's smile held no warmth whatsoever, transforming his features into something that belonged in nightmare rather than daylight. "Touch her and every generation of your family dies. That message will be delivered in language they cannot misinterpret." For the first time since entering his protection, Ava fully understood the scope of power she had placed herself beneath. Jean Wu wasn't simply a dangerous man with criminal connections. He was a force of nature barely contained within expensive suits and careful manners, capable of destruction so complete it spanned generations. The realization should have terrified her. Instead, she felt something dangerously close to desire uncurling in her chest, a recognition that being claimed by someone capable of such fierce devotion was intoxicating rather than imprisoning. "Are you afraid of me now?" Jean Wu asked, studying her face with clinical attention. "No," Ava admitted, surprising them both with her honesty. "I'm afraid of how safe you make me feel. How much I'm starting to depend on knowing you'll protect me no matter what the cost." The confession hung between them like a bridge spanning dangerous territory neither had expected to traverse. Jean Wu's carefully controlled expression cracked just enough to reveal something that might have been recognition, as if he understood exactly how seductive absolute protection could become. "That should concern you," he said quietly. "Men like me don't offer protection without expecting complete devotion in return. And what if complete devotion is what I'm starting to want to give?" The question escaped before she could stop it, revealing truths she wasn't sure she was ready to face. Jean Wu's response was a look of hunger that had nothing to do with physical desire and everything to do with emotional need so deep it threatened to consume everything in its path. "Then we're both in more danger than either the Tanaka family or Marcus Williams could ever represent," he said with devastating honesty. "Because the kind of love that survives in my world requires a willingness to lose yourself so completely that you emerge as someone entirely new." As if to punctuate his words, the sound of engines starting drifted through the study's windows, carrying his associates toward whatever violent solution he had orchestrated. Ava realized she was no longer simply accepting his protection or even appreciating his care. She was falling in love with the most dangerous man she had ever met, and the knowledge felt like stepping off a cliff into darkness that might destroy her or transform her into something she couldn't yet imagine. The compound's security alarms shattered the pre-dawn silence with mechanical screaming that sent ice through Ava's veins. She bolted upright in her bed as emergency lighting bathed the corridors in hellish red, the color of warning and spilled blood. Mrs. Chun burst through her bedroom door without ceremony, her usual composure replaced by urgent efficiency born from years of surviving crises that demanded immediate action. "Safe room, now," she commanded, already moving toward the wardrobe that Ava now realized concealed more than designer clothing. Emergency protocols require immediate compliance. But the older woman's words were lost beneath the sound of automatic weapons fire erupting from somewhere near the compound's main entrance. The sustained bursts of gunfire spoke of serious assault rather than probe or distraction, the kind of coordinated attack that suggested professional planning and overwhelming force. "Where's Jean Wu?" Ava demanded, throwing on clothes with hands that trembled despite her efforts to maintain calm. "Mr. Hyun is handling the situation," Mrs. Chun replied, though something in her tone suggested the situation might be handling him instead. "Your safety is his primary concern. You must reach the safe room immediately." More gunfire echoed through the compound's halls, closer now and accompanied by shouting in both English and Korean. Through her bedroom window, Ava glimpsed muzzle flashes lighting the gardens like deadly fireflies, transforming the peaceful landscape into a battlefield that belonged in war zones rather than residential compounds. I'm not hiding while he's fighting for his life, Ava said with surprising steel in her voice. Mrs. Chen's expression shifted to something that might have been respect mixed with exasperation. He will never forgive me if anything happens to you because I failed to follow his instructions. Then come with me to find him, Ava replied, moving toward her bedroom door despite Mrs. Chen's protests. But I'm not cowering in a safe room while the people protecting me are bleeding. The corridor outside revealed chaos barely contained by years of training and preparation. Jean Wu's associates moved with deadly purpose, their expensive suits abandoned in favor of tactical gear that emphasized function over form. Orders flew between them in rapid Korean, punctuated by weapon status reports and position updates. Through the noise and movement, Ava caught sight of Jean Wu himself near the main staircase. His usually immaculate appearance transformed into something from a nightmare. Blood streaked his shirt from a gash across his forehead, and his left sleeve was torn where a bullet had apparently come close enough to shred fabric without finding flesh. He was magnificent in his fury, moving with the controlled violence of a predator whose territory had been invaded by inferior threats. When he spotted her approaching through the tactical chaos, his expression shifted from coldly focused to something approaching panic. "What are you doing here?" he demanded, reaching her in 3 quick strides and grasping her shoulders with hands that trembled almost imperceptibly. "You should be in the safe room where nothing can reach you." "I should be wherever you are," Ava replied with conviction that surprised them both. "If someone wants to hurt me, they'll have to go through both of us." Before Jean Wu could respond, one of his lieutenants approached with information that made his face darken to winter incarnate. The rapid Korean exchange included names that made Jean Wu's jaw tighten with recognition and what sounded like casualty reports that carried personal weight. "The Tanaka family used your ex-boyfriend as bait to draw our security resources toward the wrong objectives," Jean Wu explained, his voice carrying controlled fury that promised devastating retaliation. "Marcus convinced them you would be more cooperative if rescued rather than simply taken. They're here to collect what they believe belongs to them." A new burst of gunfire erupted from the compound's east wing, followed by an explosion that shook the building's foundation and sent paintings tumbling from their carefully chosen positions on the walls. "How many of them?" Ava asked, surprised by her own calm in the face of violence that should have sent her into panic. "More than expected," Jean Wu admitted with professional assessment rather than fear. "They brought serious firepower and professional expertise. This isn't amateur hour desperation. Someone planned this assault with real intelligence about our defenses." As if summoned by his words, Marcus's voice boomed through a megaphone from somewhere beyond the compound's walls, his familiar tone twisted with rage and possessive fury that made Ava's stomach clench with recognition. "Ava, I know you're in there," Marcus shouted, his words carrying across the gunfire like accusations. "These people have been lying to you, using you. Come out now and no one else has to die for your mistakes." The casual way he assumed ownership over her choices sent fury through Ava's veins, a rage so pure it burned away fear and left only crystalline determination in its wake. "He still thinks I'm his property," she said, her voice carrying steel that made Jean Wu's eyes widen with something approaching pride. "Then we'll have to educate him otherwise," Jean Wu replied, his tone promising violence so comprehensive it would leave no room for misunderstanding. Another explosion rocked the compound, this time close enough to shatter windows and fill the air with smoke that carried the acrid scent of military-grade explosives. Through the haze, armed figures moved with tactical precision toward the main building, their coordinated advance speaking of professional training rather than criminal desperation. Jean Wu's response was swift and devastating. He issued orders in Korean that sent his associates flowing toward strategic positions with the fluid efficiency of water finding its natural course. Within seconds, the compound's defenders had transformed from scattered individuals into a coordinated force that turned every corridor into a potential killing ground. "Stay close to me," Jean Wu commanded, drawing a weapon that looked like it could stop vehicles rather than merely people. "If they want you, they'll have to take you from my corpse." The declaration should have frightened her. Instead, Ava felt something fierce and possessive uncurling in her chest, a recognition that being claimed by someone willing to die for her was intoxicating rather than terrifying. The assault reached the main building with explosive force, attackers flowing through breached entrances like deadly water, seeking every available opening. The resulting firefight transformed the compound's elegant interior into a war zone where priceless art became collateral damage and Persian rugs absorbed blood instead of displaying beauty. Jin Woo fought like a man possessed, his movements carrying the controlled violence of someone for whom killing was both profession and art form. He never moved more than arm's length from Ava's position, creating a protective circle that nothing hostile could penetrate without facing his absolute fury. When 3 attackers attempted to flank their position through the study's secondary entrance, Ava spotted the movement before Jin Woo's attention could shift from the primary threat. "Behind you," she shouted, pointing toward the danger her elevated position allowed her to see. Jin Woo spun with inhuman speed, his weapon tracking toward targets that would have killed him if her warning had come even seconds later. The brief exchange of gunfire left all 3 attackers motionless on expensive hardwood that would never quite recover from what it had witnessed. "You saved my life," Jin Woo said, his voice carrying wonder that someone under his protection had protected him in return. "That's what partners do," Ava replied with certainty that felt like revelation. They watch each other's backs. The battle reached its crescendo when Marcus himself appeared in the study's main doorway, flanked by 2 Tanaka soldiers and carrying a weapon that suggested he had embraced his criminal ally's approach to problem-solving. His face carried the particular rage of a man whose property had refused to return voluntarily. "There she is," Marcus said, his voice carrying the same possessive fury that had driven Ava from their apartment weeks earlier. "My girlfriend who got confused about where she belongs." "Ex-girlfriend," Ava corrected with steel in her voice that made both Jin Woo and Marcus reassess their understanding of her character. "And I'm exactly where I belong." Marcus's expression shifted to something uglier than simple rage, a recognition that the woman he had tried to control through fear and violence had discovered what real protection felt like. "You think this foreign killer loves you?" Marcus snarled, raising his weapon toward Jin Woo with hands that trembled with fury rather than fear. "He's using you just like everyone else. The difference is I actually care what happens to you." "No," Ava said with absolute certainty that surprised everyone present. "The difference is he makes me feel safe instead of afraid. He protects me instead of hurting me. He sees my strength instead of trying to break it." The declaration hung in the smoke-filled air like a bridge spanning the distance between her past and future, connecting who she had been with who she was becoming under Jin Woo's absolute protection. Marcus's response was to aim his weapon directly at her heart. His face twisted with the particular fury of someone whose control had been permanently severed. "If I can't have you, no one can," he said with deadly conviction. Jin Woo's movement was faster than thought, faster than fear, faster than anything human should have been capable of achieving. The gunshot that followed echoed through the study like thunder, sharp and final. Marcus crumpled to the floor, his weapon unfired and his expression frozen in permanent surprise. Jin Woo stood over his body with smoking gun and expression that belonged to divine judgment rather than human emotion. "No one threatens what belongs to me and continues breathing," Jin Woo said quietly, his voice carrying absolute finality that echoed in the sudden silence. The remaining Tanaka soldiers surrendered rather than face someone whose devotion had transformed him into something beyond human limitation. Within minutes, the compound had returned to protective silence broken only by the sound of medical personnel treating wounds and security teams restoring order to chaos. In the aftermath, as Ava cleaned blood from Jin Woo's hands with the same careful attention she had shown his earlier injury, she realized that everything had changed irrevocably. They had protected each other through life and death, chosen each other over safety, demonstrated devotion that transcended any contract or arrangement. "I almost lost you tonight," Jin Woo said quietly, his voice carrying vulnerability that had nothing to do with physical wounds. "But you didn't," Ava replied, her hands steady as she worked. "We protected each other. That's what people do when they love each other enough to risk everything." The word love settled between them like a bridge finally completed, connecting territories that had been foreign to each other until violence proved their compatibility, extended far beyond simple protection and gratitude. "I love you," Jin Woo said with the same absolute certainty he brought to every other aspect of his existence. "Completely, irrevocably, dangerously. I love you too," Ava replied, feeling the truth of it settle in her bones like foundation for everything that would follow. "All of you, the darkness and the light, the danger and the protection, everything that makes you who you are." Outside, dawn was breaking over Seattle with golden light that promised new beginnings for those brave enough to claim them. Inside the compound, two people who had found safety in each other's arms were planning a future that would reshape both their worlds completely. 3 days after the compound walls had been scrubbed clean of Marcus's blood, and the last of the Tanaka family's assets had been systematically destroyed across 2 continents, Jin Woo summoned Ava to his study for what he called a final conversation about their arrangement. Autumn sunlight streamed through windows that had been replaced after the assault, casting golden patterns across Persian rugs that showed no trace of recent violence. The study itself had been restored to its previous elegance, though Ava suspected she would always see muzzle flashes when she looked at certain corners where men had died defending what they considered sacred. Jin Woo sat behind his desk in a charcoal suit that emphasized the lean power of his frame, though something in his posture suggested nervous energy rather than his usual controlled stillness. Before him lay the same leather folder that had contained her original protection contract, its contents presumably ready for whatever business conclusion he had summoned her to witness. "Sit," he said, indicating the chair across from his desk where this relationship had formally begun weeks earlier. Ava complied, noting how the familiar ritual felt entirely different when approached as an equal rather than a supplicant seeking sanctuary. The woman who settled into the leather chair bore little resemblance to the terrified refugee who had first signed Jin Woo's contract, though she supposed transformation was inevitable when love replaced desperation as motivation. "I've asked you here to discuss the termination of our original agreement," Jin Woo began with characteristic directness. The words struck her chest like physical blows, though she managed to keep her expression composed despite the sudden terror that he was preparing to release her back into a world that no longer felt like home. "I see," she said carefully, proud that her voice remained steady. Jin Woo's expression softened almost imperceptibly, suggesting he recognized her struggle to maintain composure despite obvious distress. "You entered my protection because circumstances gave you no alternative," he continued, opening the leather folder to reveal documents she remembered signing with trembling hands. "That contract bound you to my authority in exchange for safety from threats you couldn't handle independently." Ava nodded, unsure where his logical recitation was leading, but certain she wouldn't like the destination. "Those threats no longer exist," Jin Woo stated with absolute certainty. "Marcus Williams is dead. The Tanaka family has been eliminated as an operational entity. Your former life holds no dangers that my organization cannot neutralize permanently." The clinical assessment should have provided comfort. Instead, it felt like preparation for abandonment, as if Jin Woo was systematically removing every justification for keeping her under his protection. "What are you saying?" she asked, though part of her already understood with crystalline clarity. "I'm saying that the original reason for our arrangement has been resolved." Jin Woo lifted the protection contract from its folder and, with deliberate ceremony, fed it into the paper shredder beside his desk. The machine's mechanical grinding seemed to devour not just legal documents but the entire foundation of their relationship. "You're free," he said when the last fragments had been consumed. "Completely and absolutely free to return to whatever life you choose to build for yourself." The declaration should have been liberating. Instead, Ava felt as if the floor had disappeared beneath her feet, leaving her suspended over an abyss of possibility that felt more terrifying than any captivity. "And if I don't want to leave?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jin Woo's carefully controlled expression cracked just enough to reveal hunger that had nothing to do with duty or obligation, and everything to do with personal needs so deep it threatened to consume everything in its path. "Then you would be choosing to stay with me not because circumstances force that choice, but because you want to build a life that includes everything I am and everything I represent." The distinction mattered more than legal technicalities or formal arrangements, transforming their relationship from protection contract to genuine partnership based on mutual desire rather than desperate necessity. "I choose you," Ava said with absolute certainty that surprised them both. "Not your protection or your resources or your ability to keep me safe from external threats. I choose the man who reads poetry about duty and honor. I choose someone who loved his sister enough to carry guilt about her death for years. I choose the person who sees my strength instead of my vulnerability." Jin-woo rose from his chair with fluid grace and moved around the desk to stand before her, his dark eyes holding an intensity that made her pulse quicken for reasons that had nothing to do with fear. "Choosing me means choosing a life where danger is always present, where enemies will target you because hurting you hurts me, where the price of loving someone like me is accepting that normal will never be an option." "I know exactly what I'm choosing," Ava replied, rising to meet him at eye level despite the height difference between them. "I'm choosing someone who would burn the world down to keep me safe. Someone who sees protecting the people he loves as the only thing worth being good at." The confession hung between them like a bridge spanning territory neither had expected to traverse when a desperate woman had stumbled into an alley where dangerous men conducted lethal business. "In that case," Jin-woo said quietly, "there's something else we need to discuss." He reached into his jacket and withdrew a small velvet box that seemed to contain possibilities rather than simply jewelry. When he opened it, the ring inside caught sunlight like trapped fire, its design somehow managing to suggest both Eastern and Western traditions while belonging entirely to neither. "I'm asking you to be my wife," Jin-woo said with the same absolute certainty he brought to every other aspect of his existence. "Not because you need my protection or because circumstances force convenient arrangements, but because I want to spend whatever time I have left making sure you never doubt how completely you are loved." The proposal should have surprised her. Instead, it felt like the logical culmination of everything that had developed between them since that first night when terror had driven her to seek sanctuary with the most dangerous man she had ever met. "Yes," she said without hesitation, extending her hand so he could place the ring where it belonged. "Yes to partnership instead of protection. Yes to choosing each other every day regardless of external threats. Yes to building something together that's stronger than either of us could be alone." The ring fit perfectly, its weight somehow managing to suggest security rather than constraint, chosen bond rather than imposed obligation. The ceremony 3 weeks later blended Korean traditions with acknowledgments of Ava's strength and independence, creating something entirely unique that reflected the people they had become together rather than conforming to expectations others might have imposed. Jin-woo's associates, who had initially questioned his decision to protect a stranger, now treated Ava with respect that went beyond mere deference to their boss's preferences. Mrs. Chun had arranged flowers that spoke of new beginnings rather than simple celebration, while the compound itself had been transformed into something that felt more like home than fortress, though Ava suspected the security systems remained as comprehensive as ever. During the ceremony, conducted by a minister who asked no questions about the groom's profession or the circumstances that had brought them together, Jin-woo made promises that went beyond traditional vows to encompass partnership in every aspect of their shared existence. "I promise to protect you without controlling you," he said, his voice carrying absolute conviction. "I promise to respect your strength while offering my own. I promise to love you completely enough that you never question your decision to choose this life with me." Ava's responding vows acknowledged the transformation she had undergone while accepting his protection. The way loving someone capable of such fierce devotion had changed her understanding of what safety could mean. "I promise to stand with you through whatever dangers our love might create," she replied, meaning every word completely. "I promise to see your protection as proof of devotion rather than evidence of control. I promise to choose you every day for the rest of our lives, regardless of what the world might think about our beginning." The wedding reception revealed the scope of Jin-woo's influence, drawing associates and allies from across the Pacific Rim who came to acknowledge not just his marriage but his choice to share power with someone who had earned her place through courage rather than inheritance or negotiation. Later that evening, as they stood together on the compound's main balcony, watching Seattle's skyline glitter in the distance, Ava realized how completely her life had been transformed from the desperate flight that had begun their relationship. "Do you ever regret that night in the alley?" Jin-woo asked, his arms circling her waist in a gesture that had become as natural as breathing. Never, Ava replied with absolute honesty. It led me to you. It led me to understanding what real protection feels like. It led me to discovering that the most dangerous man I'd ever met was also the safest place I'd ever found. 6 months later, the compound had evolved into something that balanced fortress with home, its security systems comprehensive enough to deter any imaginable threat, while its interior spaces reflected the warmth that came from being shared by people who had chosen each other completely. Ava had taken on responsibilities within Jean Wu's organization that utilized her intelligence and education while respecting the boundaries both had agreed were necessary to maintain. She wasn't simply the boss's wife, but a partner whose judgment was valued, and whose protection was considered sacred by everyone who worked with them. The woman who had once fled through Seattle's rain-soaked streets in terror had become someone who commanded respect through competence rather than simply association, though she never forgot that her safety remained guaranteed by someone whose love manifested as absolute devotion. On quiet evenings, they still sat together in the study where their relationship had been formalized, Jean Wu reading his classical poetry, while Ava worked on projects that would have been impossible in her previous life. The scent of sandalwood and bergamot had become as familiar as her own heartbeat, a constant reminder that she had found her way to exactly where she belonged. The cage had become a chosen sanctuary, captivity had transformed into partnership, and the most dangerous love either had ever experienced had proved to be the foundation for everything beautiful they would build together in whatever time remained.